All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you could be joining us today. My name is Stephanie, and I will be your co-host for today's webinar. Now, today's webinar is a part of our BrainHQ Academy series, which is a series of webinars that we host every other month, where we talk about the neuroscience behind different topics. Today's topic is a very exciting one called the brain as a time machine. Now, let's go over the agenda for today. So, shortly after this agenda is done, Mike is going to go ahead and kick off with a wonderful presentation. Now, Mike, if you are not familiar with him, maybe haven't tuned into one of our webinars before, is a returning guest. Dr. Michael Merzenich is the co-founder of Posit Science, our chief scientific officer, and the original brain behind BrainHQ. For nearly 5 decades, he's been a leading pioneer in brain plasticity research and has published more than 150 articles in leading peer-reviewed journals. Now, during that presentation, there may be a couple of points where we might ask you to write in a couple of answers. We'll ask you some free-form questions. To write in those answers, click the chat button in the Zoom control panel, and then a little window will pop up where you can type in your responses there. Similarly, at any point during the presentation, if you'd like to ask a question, there's a Q&A button on the Zoom control panel that you can click on, and a new window will pop up where you can type in your questions. Now, there are a lot more of you than there are me and Mike, so we aren't going to be able to answer every question today, but I will do my best to curate and moderate and group as many of those questions together as possible so we can answer as many of them as possible. Now, the last thing that I wanted to note is that today's webinar is being recorded and it will get posted to our YouTube channel in the coming days. If you'd like to be notified when that video is available, you'll get an email notification if you go to youtube.com/brainhq and then subscribe there. All right, so let's go ahead and Mike, let's get you in the call. Hey, there you go. How you doing, Mike?
I'm in good shape. Ready for action.
I love that. I'm so excited for this presentation. I've seen a bunch of it already, and you guys are in for like such a treat. Right. So Mike, you can go ahead and screen share whenever you are ready.
Okay. All right. I'll do that. Thanks, Stephanie. Okay. First of all, I'm going to talk about your brain as a time machine because it is a time machine. And we're going to talk a lot about what we mean by that. Right. Well, first of all, it provides you with a really remarkable recorded representation of your historic past. And that's a pretty amazing thing if you think about it. You know, you have your past basically available to you, accessible to you in time in your brain. And then it also has powerful powers of prediction for your immediate future and for your more distant future. In a sense, that's what the brain is doing. The brain is reading your past up to the moment, and on the basis of your action at the point, it's also making a prediction about what happens next. And that's very valuable to you. It's very valuable. It's really controlling all of your operations. And then it deploys time-based processes to play out all of your activities and your abilities. So you're operating in the domain, of course, continuously of time. And it creates, it manipulates, and it richly exploits time in all of your operations in conscious thought and in the control of all of your actions. You're operating continuously in the domain, in the context of time, of course. Its functional evolution is fundamentally time-based. It's actually evolving you, your abilities, everything you understand about the world, your world. It's all been created on the basis of what occurs moment by moment together and what occurs across time. It's all time-based. And then finally, its powerfully predictive and memory processes support really remarkable human powers. You think you go to the movie and you see, you get in a time machine and you go forward in time, backward, boy, isn't that amazing? Well, you have the power of mental time travel anytime you want to call it up. You have a reconstructed past and you have a highly predictable future in your own brain. You can move forward in time and backward in time in an amazing way. And we're going to talk quite a bit about that and how that's achieved in your brain in this talk. It's really all about time. You know, basically your life, your brain is hanging everything on the curtain of time. It's all about creating your everything you know, everything you understand, all of your operations, you could say, on a fabric of time, which is a pretty amazing thing. Now that raises several questions, interesting questions. The first question is, what the heck is time, right? It's not something that you can hold in your hand. It's not physical. The physicists can't describe it in any by the laws that apply to things that are material. It's not material. It's like consciousness. In a sense, it's a mystery. And people have struggled with understanding what it is exactly, you could say, because of that. And the philosophers have argued, the physicists argue, and the neuroscientists, you're going to say, are entering this argument. Now, for us, second, is the past and the future real? Or is it only reality, the present? Now, most people hold to the notion, not very understandably, that what in the present moment is real, but the past is past. It's no longer real. And what's in the future is still not here, not real yet. This view, philosophically, is called presentism. We live in the present. We think of the reality as being in the present moment, and somehow the past is back there and the future is up there. We see time, we see life, we see time as an arrow. It started somewhere back in our early days and it's going somewhere. Time is an arrow. That's and it's almost inescapable. We don't know how else to think about it, really. Well, unfortunately, this guy showed up, and other people of his ilk added to the confusion, not just from the general law of Einstein, but also of relativity, but also the quantum physicists entered into the argument, and it added chaos in where the brain is, in where the world is going. You know, that butterfly flaps its wings, and then all kinds of the world has changed. Everything has changed by that. All of these things basically generated confusion about time. Well, not to them, because the general theory of relativity argued that time was a dimension. Like the three-dimensional space, it's the fourth dimension. And they adopted a position which is called eternalism. That is, every time is real. Time is a dimension. Okay, just like linear distance is a dimension. Time is a dimension. So we don't have time to argue about these issues from the point of view of philosophy but it's interesting to think that we have a special from our brain a problem from the point of view of how physicists think of time, or they have a problem with us. Einstein himself said, time must be, in our own mind, a kind of invention of our brain, invention of our mind. Because he knew that in his world, eternalism and not presentism applied. He knew that an observer could see two things happening that we would think of as being simultaneous, but in his world could be non-simultaneous and both real. And that's an important, it's important food for thought. And third, is there a clock in our brain? We know we can keep time in a sense, maybe not very precisely, but we're pretty good at timekeeping in lots of ways. How do our brains keep time? How do they keep track of time? And then fourth, well, what accounts for our conscious dimensions of time? Why and how does our brain use time to organize itself? Now, we're going to talk about that. Now, first of all, your brain does have a kind of primitive clock. And it actually has several clocks that are similar, but the primary clock, you could say, in the brain involves processes deep in the brain of most animals that on planet Earth have a clock like this. And it's actually tuned to the daily cycle of light and darkness to establish an approximately 24-hour circadian rhythm. It's called a circadian because it's circa 24 hours. And it's also called a diurnal rhythm, the rhythm of you could say day, night, day, night, day, night. And it's actually expressed by biological processes that basically, in a sense, change in a reliable way across the period of approximately 24 hours, and come back to square one at the end of that 24 hours and restart. And in this clock deep in the brain has a strategy for reading the approximate position where you are in the circle of time and makes use of it. It makes use of it to control neurological processes and ultimately processes in our body to take maximum advantages of the environmental resources that apply to the creature we are. Now, different creatures have different demands. Some operate primarily as hunters or gatherers at night, where we operate primarily during the day. And we rest and we hide from our enemies at night. You know, we're operating in a dither rhythm and we're restoring ourselves at night. The way we feed ourselves, the way we operate in the world is substantially governed by our sleep cycle, our waking is governed by the circadian clock. Now, it's not like a clock on your wall. It's not like the clock on your wrist. You know, they operate by a different principle. Now, the way our clock operates is that it basically has a reliable periodic event, physical event. Maybe it's the movement of a pendulum, which always takes exactly the same time, you could say, to go through a cycle. And what the clock is doing is counting them. It's counting those number of tick-tocks, right? The swings of the pendulum. And that accumulated number is passing time. Or it might be the vibration of a crystal, or it might be some other physical process that's very, very high reliably, exactly the same time each time it occurs. And then the other end of the clock, it's counting those events. So with incredible precision, unbelievable precision, we can measure time with the clock. We don't have anything that counts the ticks of the clock. We have nothing like that. Our clocking is based upon the passing of events in time, but we're not accumulating it in the same way. It's a different kind of strategy that we've evolved within our brains. Now, thank goodness that clock is adjustable. We can actually make adjustments in it. It's self-adjusting. If it wasn't, we'd have a lot of trouble when we move across time zones in a modern life. And adjustment is slow. It has to adjust because the day light and the nighttime cycle, the length, the duration of darkness and light changes, of course, across the year. It also changes when we move rapidly across the surface of the planet. It takes us about an hour to move an hour across the Earth in time zone. We have to take about a day to recover. So it's not a fast process of recovery, but it's fast enough to deal with the changes in the day-night cycle in our daily lives. And it works wonderfully for us for what it does. It initiate our sleeping, initiate our waking, and so forth. Now, our circadian clock has very little to do with how we track time moment by moment across the hours of our day. So that's another completely different kettle of fish. And it has little to do with the temporal processes, the time-based processes that govern our creation of a time-mapped history or our future. We're wonderful at doing that. It has little to do with the time-based plastic genesis, origin of our operational personhoods. That's how we create ourselves on the basis of what happens moment by moment in time. And it has relatively little to do with our remarkable mental time travel ability. And we're going to talk about those processes and how those arise in our brain in a minute. So how does our brain construct our sense of time? I mean, what's it up to? Well, first of all, a child begins to associate time with distance. And that association is often relates to association of time with physical dimensions of our world provides a key basis for estimating passing time. So near and far and short and long and distant apply equally as well to space and time. We basically begin to associate the dimensions in physical space with the passage of time. So to think of a simple case of it, you know, we begin to understand the relationship between the time that passes when we get to, let's say, grandma's house, right? And in all kinds of ways, we're associating the physical dimensions of our world with the passage of time. Now, I'm going to ask you, maybe to add a comment in chat. How long does it take you? How would you express how long it takes you to get to the nearest grocery store? you might think of adding your response to that in chat. We might look at a few of your responses about that later. And my guess is that you can come up with a pretty accurate estimate of how far it is and how long it takes you to get there. And through processes like this, we become very good at estimating time, even at a young age. Across the span of our early life, we become master timekeepers. We develop a really wonderful ability to be able to weigh the passage of time in our lives and in our everyday operations and actions. Now, how do we do it when there's no clock ticking in our brains? We don't really have a clock in there doing it. How do we keep track of passage of time? And for a long time, this has really puzzled neuroscientists. They didn't have any really very clear answer to it. But now I think the more popular, the predominant position is that what the brain is doing is it's constructing our sense of time by sensing the natural churn of ongoing brain activities, which have very predictable durations, very predictable operations are time-based, and these time-based processes are very predictable across time. And they occur with predictable regularity. So whenever there's an event or action that occurs in the brain, when something starts, you could say the time starts in point A, that these events occur, we have a sense of how many, you could say cycle, how much churning is occurring, to get to time B. And we use that to weigh the time. Probably the foremost experimentalist and theorist that's involved in this is a former fellow of mine, Dean Buonamano, who's a wonderful expert in this subject, a professor at the University of California at Los Angeles. And he's created beautiful and elegant models and studies that demonstrate how this could work, how this probably works in the brain. Now, in that sense, if that kind of process, in the sense there's a kind of clock, not a clock like a clock and wall, but a kind of clock everywhere in your brain. You could say everyone is going through these churning processes, and that time passage from any significant event basically is being recorded anywhere in the brain with operation. That's why if we think about if we direct our conscious attention to any different process that we can locate in the brain, we can usually reconstruct those actions in the framework of time. And we think that timekeeping is occurring in that area, in every area of the brain, as a function of the activities that's now pretty reliably and predictably occurring in that process, in that region, in that brain, in that part of the brain. But in a sense, your brain is clocking everything. It's measuring everything across the span of time. And that's how you're doing all of this wonderful timekeeping. Now, also time is governing plasticity. It's a fundamental contributor, or you could say an aspect of the brain basically controlling itself, controlling its change. The brain is rewired when what has just happened in immediate past time, matters to you, matters to the brain. That's a fundamental thing the brain is doing in controlling when it permits change. It permits change when it makes a judgment. It has complicated ways of doing this, of course, that what has just happened in immediate past time, just happened back there, matters to you. And it says, in a sense, save that one. That was a good one. And it's doing this continually. Now, this is sometimes called the law of consequence. The brain basically is looking at the consequences. It's weighing the consequences. Was this just rewarding to me? Did I just get the answer just a little bit more? Did I make a little progress in what I'm trying to get better at? Is this really interesting and something I should record, something I should remember forever? Whenever something like that occurs, the brain says, say that one, that was a good one. And it changes its connectivity, it changes you. It's remodeling you. The brain is strengthening all of the connections that were active together. Although this active in that moment of time, in that just important, just preceding active moment. Everything that is active just then was that some of those things was the index of what was important. It saves it. It saves it as you progress in improving an ability. Each time those things that contributed to that little better, it saves those and saves and saves and saves. And it's on the path to perfection. It's on the path to growing knowledge. It's on the path to recording information that's really important and so forth. The brain is physically linking any other important activities that reliably occur in successive time. So the next thing that occurs in successive time, or the important word occurs in successive time to master something, it's linking it physically. And it's associating any other thing that commonly occurs in that general time frame. It's linking it to that present moment in time. That's how we construct our world. When we follow these simple, basic simple time-based rules that govern brain plasticity, we can change the brain for the better at will. And really, that's what BrainHQ is all about. We began to understand several decades ago how we could, in a sense, harness the genie. We understood the rules that applied to how the brain changes for its own benefit, you could say, as a function of our experiences on the basis of how things are arriving in the brain in time. And with that knowledge, we understand how to change the brain, in a sense, for the better. And that's what we do in BrainHQ. That's what we're trying to do. Now, the brain uses time to create you, as I just said, and to construct that wonderful model of the world that you operate in. I'd illustrate that by talking about a simple example. Consider the apple. Now, you think about something like an apple. We could take any one of a million things that you have a conception of, that you identify. In the apple, we think about the things that constitute the basis of appleness. It has a certain shape, a stem commonly, not always, coming out of the top, and that little well in the top, and another little well of different nature in the bottom. It has a shiny surface. Surfaces has a certain level of hardness, little bit of give, but pretty hard, pretty solid. It has a smell, clear, distinctive odor. If we were to bite it into it, it would have a particular crunchy. You can feel it in your mouth almost, can't you? You feel the aroma, you feel it, you taste it. Very distinctive. All of these things we associate with appleness. And that's the basis of all of those things concurring in time that generate our ability to identify it as an apple. Its appleness. It's the combination of those things that occur in time. It's all time-based. The brain strengthens all of those things that go together in time to represent appleness. Now, it associates those apples with that myriad of things that predict apples or are related to them. Now, you might participate in this a little bit by going to the chat and telling us about a thing or two that are predicted to you when you think of apple. What else comes to mind when you think of apple? You might take a moment, and I'll give you a moment to talk about some of the things you might relate to an apple. Well, you might think of, you might think of a tree. A tree might lead you to an orchard, or maybe you might see a tractor, a farm, something. Maybe your backyard. Or you might think of a pie. Oh, yeah, apple pie. Wow. And think of that crust of the apple pie, boy, and this aroma. And the wonderful smell of it, the smell of it. And you might see it on a plate, in front of you with ice cream. That might carry you to a thought about grandma. Oh, this is a grandma. This is actually my wife, Diane. I'm not sure she'd like to be called a, but she is a grandma, authentically, 5 times over. And boy, she can make a good apple pie. I can tell you right now, you would not get a better one than you could get from her, or her mother was a wonderful apple pie producer. Great reason to go visit grandma anytime. The point is that 1,000 things we can easily be carried to from anything like this. And it's all carried to us by changes in our brain, actually changes in our physical connections in our brain, basically that carry us from thought, to concept across time. It's all mounted on the fabric of time. And through these physical brain rewiring operations, it puts apples in their proper place in time, their proper place in the world. All of the things that we might associate with or belong with them in the neighborhood that they operate in our world. And we do this with everything that we understand or try to understand. Now, the effectiveness of our plasticity machinery that's doing all of this is a direct function of how sharply, how saliently, how clearly we engage the machinery of our brains moment by moment in time. That's the number one basis of having a strong brain that's operating with high efficiency, highly effectively. The more sharply we represent each temporal moment, each time information comes into the brain, or each time the brain basically is delivering information from one location to another, the more salient it is, the clearer it is, the more coordinated it is, that action. The more strongly we can link or associate the information that underlies what it is, recognition of what it is, the more clearly we can control the flow of action in thought, in forward time. How strongly we'll predict what we should do next or where we're going to go with this thought or with this information just received. And that's really important that that machinery be in tip-top shape in your and every other brain of anyone you care about. And the more powerfully, if a brain in such condition, we can engage the higher level machinery, because that's where you keep track of forward time. You keep track of it up here. That's one of big human asset to support mental time travel back to our memories, but also forward to our predictions, to our dreams. We have remarkable capacity to carry ourselves in our mind forward. It's the great defining special human ability. Okay, we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. Now, we have special capacities, we humans, in going forward in time. No one is as good as we are. Now, an animal like a dog, this is my dog, Doug. He's a great dog. I love Doug. But anyway, Doug has a good memory in a lot of ways. I mean, he knows a lot that relates to immediate time. You know, Doug knows when he's in my car, when he's I would say a half mile away from home. He knows he's going to be home pretty soon, and he's pretty excited about it. And by the time we arrive home, he's almost jumping out of the car. He likes being home. And then also, Doug, if someone basically approaches my house and he hears them on the steps, I have a long staircase coming up to my house, a long series of steps. He hears them, and he knows pretty reliably whether it's somebody that's special to him. It could be another dog, or there's a handful of people that he just loves to see. And he shows by his actions that he knows that they're coming. He has a wonderful memory and a wonderful ability to respond in a relatively immediate time. But Doug, on the other hand, is not likely to pick up a stone and to understand that if he chipped off this stone and sharpens it, he might later be able to fasten it to a stick of wood and create something very useful out of it, like an axe. He doesn't have that kind of forward time travel ability. And Doug is very unlikely to plant seeds in the ground and wait for 5 or 6 months and then come back later and from those now plants that have grown up, basically harvest their fruits. And after months of waiting, have them be a reliable source, you could say, of food and sustenance to them. He does not have that kind of forward time travel. We humans have that ability in spades. We can move forward in time just like in the movies, not quite as such high resolution, but we can do it to a remarkable way. And it's one of our big secrets. We do it by the processes that are occurring in our frontal cortex, the processes of extended prediction and operations in conscious thought. What a gift. In the same way, you can look at an animal like a blue jay. A blue jay hides his food. He hides it. He hides it. He commonly stashes it. He might stash a grub. He might stash a nut. And you know that the blue jay is thinking forward, just like we're thinking forward. For example, if I stash a grub in a nut and then I don't let the bluejay at him for a week, the bluejay knows that the grub is no longer edible. He goes straight to the nut. He doesn't fool with the grub. He knows. He's predicted it. Almost every animal has some ability, but it's always time limited. Animals do not predict over long periods of time like we do. We're unique in this respect. We're special. Now, improving these key abilities to support all of this wonderful stuff, is really what BrainHQ is all about. It's all about trying to sharpen, to increase the salience of the information that you're shipping around in your brain so that you never lose the powers, you could say, to operate in this wonderful way of moving across this critical dimension of time in your operations, in action, and in thought. So finally, I want to just say a little bit about how we use time and how we make accurate distinctions in time, because that's also plastic. Now you can say, well, what are you talking about? Well, it turns out that many of the fine distinctions that we make about what we hear, what we see, or what we feel is primarily time-based. It's based upon the cues or information we receive in the time dimension specifically. For example, if I say the word papa, or pa, papa, or I might say the word baba, baby might say that, baba, ba. The difference between a pa and a ba is a tiny little gap in time. After the pa, pa, it's a tiny little gap in time. In many ways, we use a little piece of information to distinguish things that are very clear to us as indistinguishable. Now, in almost every dimension of our operations, we are making use of time to basically evaluate what's happening or what's just happening. And commonly what we do is we integrate information in time in a powerful way, and we manipulate it, even though it requires some fiddling. So an example, if I'm talking to you, it turns out that in fact, the image from my face is arriving just a little bit earlier than my voice, because time, vision, light is faster, moving faster, far faster than sound. Sound wave is slower. So it's lightning strikes and you have to wait a while before you hear that. So it turns out that if I'm talking to you across the yard, there's actually a significant lag between what you're receiving in sound and what you're seeing on my lips. But the brain integrates the two, so they're a match. And you have to have a pretty big separation in time between what you're hearing and what you're seeing before it's a mismatch. Seems perfectly natural. So actually you have to lag it before the movie is a kilter. And you have to actually have a pretty big difference between the time and the sound before the brain doesn't integrate. Brain fools with it. Now, on the other hand, if I move the sound just a little bit before what you see, the brain's not full for a second. It knows it's a mismatch. Doesn't look right at all. Doesn't sound right at all in relation to what you see, because it's expecting the sound to follow what you see. In all kinds of ways, the brain basically is making these adjustments in time. It's manipulating time. It's using time to code, to interpret information. The brain also has incredibly predictive powers in time. I can say, let's say, my father was and the brain is predicting what the next word might be in my mind. It's also predicting what the next word you might say in your mind. It does this all the time. It's making this immediate forward prediction all the time. Our precise reading of timing cues is progressively plastically degraded in older individuals. It's plastic. And it goes to hell in older individuals who are not spending enough time exercising their brains in an appropriate way. Older is slower. You get old. It is a general belief. It's not necessarily slower, but it's slower if you don't organize and exercise your brain. And organized time travel defaults in an older brain. You lose the ability to mind wandering. Now the brain, as it's moving across the landscape of time, doesn't really know where it's going with any high accuracy unless you do something about it. So in all kinds of ways, you can lose control of these wonderful processes that are keeping control of time and using time in coding. And there's a whole series. I mean, just say, this is not something that this is something you can always get better at. Here's a guy that was really incredibly amazing in the peak of his professional football career, Tom Brady. No one released the ball faster than he did, made decisions in the football field faster than he did about where to throw the ball and how to move on the field than he did. He was probably the greatest quarterback in history in his overall effectiveness by operating in time. And he trained himself in the middle of his career, sort of at the peak of his profession, using BrainHQ, and he got better at making fast decisions in time about what he was seeing that led to more accurate and more controlled action. You can get better. Anyone can get better. And keeping your brain in tip-top shape, you could say, and sustaining your speed and containing your highly effective activities as your brain is prone to go south, you can drive it back in a positive direction if you do something about it. Now, a host of neurological issues degrade your timekeeping ability. Just about everything that goes wrong in the brain basically degrades your ability to keep information in time, especially those things that impact this frontal area of your brain. So if you have ADHD, you can have a time blindness. You just, all the time, you just lose track of where things are moving in across the vein of time. You know, it can be terribly, in a sense, disabling. If your part of your brain is really affected in a condition like, let's say, schizophrenia, you can't remember, you can't keep track of what just happened or who just did what. You're not sure whether you just did that or someone else just did it or God just did it. You're not sure because you lose the ability to control these other critical associations of what's happening across the passage of time. In many conditions, basically, time keeping is tremendously disturbed. That occurs in a condition like Parkinson's disease, occurs in MS, it occurs when you have long COVID, occurs in a lot of conditions. You basically are degraded in your timekeeping abilities. Now, all of those things are addressable to some extent or a substantial extent, or maybe completely by exercising your brain in appropriate ways. So this is something that we're trying to apply broadly across these domains to help people that are struggling with these time-related issues. You can get lots better at sustaining a high-speed, temporally precise brain that will reliably support your wonderful powers of mental time travel. I mean, let's face it, this is one of the best things you can do, and extend that time in life when you take full advantage of and fully enjoy your operations, your wonderful operations across the domain of time. So your brain is a time machine. It's an amazing gift if you think about it. You can time travel anytime you like. Go back and reflect about things that happened in your life that were wonderful, or maybe are special memories to you. You can go forward in time with amazing powers of prediction and prescience. And you can live, in a sense, the future anytime you like, in a highly controlled way. And invent all kinds of things that could be wonderful in your life in ways that are positively enriching. And that can lead you to do things that you think you could never do before. It's our big secret. It's the basis of our inventions, basis of our creativity, of our species. It's what our brain was made to do. Our brain was made to control our operations in time so that our life and our world made sense. So anyway, that's all I have to say about time. I just want to say, I wanted to give this talk with my dear friend, Dean Bonamano, who is, again, a former student of mine, and he's written a wonderful book about time. And I want to end by just recommending this book, Your Brain is a Time Machine. And one of the things that's wonderful about it is Dean was also trained as a physicist, and he talks both about the physics and the neuroscience of time. And this is really an interesting thing, because he explains to you how a physicist could be so dumb as not to think that the arrow must apply, the arrow of time. It actually has the time as a dimension. And if you want to struggle with something nerdy like that, this is a really good book, full of insight and full of intelligence, full of scholarship. I highly recommend. So I've enjoyed talking to you about this, and it's an important subject for you. And I look forward to your questions, and maybe have a conversation about it now.
Yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely. So Mike, fantastic presentation. I got little snippets of it before we got started, and it was everything that you had promised and even more. So thank you so much for your time in that presentation. We do have quite a few questions coming in. We had some people come in with questions hot off the press before we even opened up the webinar today. But before we get to those, we had a couple of people write into us before the webinar last week when we sent out the invites, and they had a couple of questions that I wanted to run by you.
Okay.
All right, so somebody had asked, hey, there's the phrase time flies when you're having fun. Why does time seem to move at different rates depending on what we're doing? If we're having a good time, time seems to go fast. If we're having a, slow day, it's stuck in a waiting room, for example, why does time feel like it goes on forever?
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? I mean, you can be you can imagine you're on you're going on a holiday and you're stuck in the airport and the plane is delayed, and you think, God, are you ever going to get out of here? And it's horrible, and seems to go on forever. And then you land and you finally get to the place where you're going. Maybe I end up in Italy, and everything is exciting, and everything I'm seeing is fun, and food is great, and I'm seeing I go into all of this. And at times seem to fly by, and before you know it, you got to get on the damn plane again. Well, and then so in one case, time just seems to be so pokey and so slow, and going, and on the other hand, seems to be so fast. And then when you think back upon the trip, and you think, well, what do I remember? How long was I in the airport? It goes, it's a flash. And then you think about the trip itself, and you say, you go on and on and on. Your brain goes on and on and on. Basically, you're there forever. And so partly it relates to your, sort of the level of action that's occurring. And when the action is occurring, basically, things are spinning by. When the level of action is slow, when there are relatively few events occurring, basically that churning is occurring at in a relatively slow and modest way. And so we are continually having these fluctuations in how things are going by, you could say, in time. Now, if we're actually asked to think about it and to weigh it, we're much more accurate. If you sat down and said, okay, I'm in this airline terminal, and I'm sitting here, and okay, I'm going to count when a minute goes by, you could be pretty accurate. Right, but we have these sort of hierarchical ways that we think about these spans of time in which we can be very inaccurate, or you could say very much what we perceive as very much a function of circumstance, and it's all neurological, and but I have to do some hand waving to explain these differences.
Sure. Now we had a couple of questions come in. You had mentioned ADHD and time blindness and schizophrenia. Can you elaborate on what time blindness is? Ron is asking, could you talk about time blindness? And we have a number of people actually who have written in specifically about time blindness as it relates to ADHD. Can you talk maybe a little bit about that?
Right. Well, what happens is that you're in a time flow, you could say, and then you're just disrupted. And so there's disruptions that occur all the time. So, you lose the tracking of it. And it's because your brain basically is easily interfered with. You have sources of interference. You could say the brain is not successfully suppressing things that are distracting you. You could call them sort of uncontrolled activities. Your brain is not really yoked those down the way it should have, and it's really an indication of that. And it's an important problem. It's not just a matter of focusing or controlling your attentiveness. It's also a matter of these things that can arise in your mind, that arise in your brain, that can carry you off the beam. And these can be these interruptions can be very frequent and very common in a person with ADHD. So those interruptions basically degrade your ability to keep track of time over any significant period of time. So you're blind to it. So that's one of the things. Now take a condition like schizophrenia. when what you're doing commonly is in life is your every action, every time you talk, every time you think, every time you feel, you're basically recording that information in the brain in what's called working memory. And across that working memory span, you're associating that action, that feeling, that thought with its source. And the source is you. So you're keeping track of where it's coming from, where it's coming from in the world. I just heard that, but then I also that feeling, I know it's coming from me, but I also know that thing is coming from out there. I'm making those associations, right? And so now, what if working memory is not working very well? And commonly when you age or when, lots of conditions, it's deteriorating. And you're not so reliably holding it there so to make these cross-reference associations. Now, in the case of schizophrenia, it's defective. It's working very poorly. And it just can't keep track of you as the source. And because it's not constantly referencing you as a source, you become weaker and weaker as a presence in the brain, and other alternative sources become stronger. Okay, so one of the important things is not to fade away in old age and to work hard not to fade away. You want to keep that source, which is you, strong in your brain. And to do that, you need to sustain these processes in the front of your brain in good stead, so that you always make appropriate and strong references to the things that relate to what you've just seen. And just, you want to make those associations strong, especially to yourself. It also relates to how strong you can sustain control of your life, control of your actions, control of your emotions, control of yourself, so you don't slip into addiction or you don't start misbehaving in some way. All of these things come from having an unhealthy brain that's not really keeping track of things in time in a strong and effective way. So anyway, it's a complicated subject.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like we could do a whole webinar just on that, honestly.
Yes, that would be fun to do a webinar on that, actually.
It would, yeah. It's absolutely fascinating.
Right.
All right. So we had a question come in last week when we announced the webinar, but also quite a few other people have written in asking about, people who are going through traumatic events like a car crash often say that time slowed down for them in that instant.
Right.
So what's sort of happening?
Isn't that interesting? And it's well documented. It's well documented that people do have this, and it's not completely clear. It's clear when you recount it that it's slow. It's not completely clear exactly what happens in the moment, because in the moment time does go by fast, right? but when you account it, when it comes back to you, it can be incredibly slow, and all kinds of things that kind of have arisen in your memory that aren't maybe specific to the event itself. Maybe you have some reflection about that comes back to other things in your life, or suddenly you're thinking about someone you love, or something you really care about, or something that's really important to you from your past, or something that doesn't necessarily relate very directly to what's happening to you as you fall off the cliff. But what's very, very clear is that when you fall off and the other thing that happens that's really interesting is that you're supercharged to do the right corrective action. You do things that are almost superhuman commonly where you're in that situation in corrective action. So on the one hand, you could say things are going very slowly. On the other hand, you do things that retrospectively can be amazing. Now, why does time go by so slowly in your recounting of your memory of it? Seemed like forever. In a sense, it's because it was so supercharged, you could say. It's a little bit like thinking about what happened in Italy when you're having all of that fun. You were in a supercharged mode, and we know it relates or we believe it relates to the fact that things were of such high moment that and basically in your recollection of them, they are constructed in incredible detail, in strong form. So you could say that the replaying of things is modulated or functioned to some extent the power that the information was received, or the power that it had affected it had on you when it occurred. So you could say that thing could be mostly exciting, or sometimes it's terrible. You remember things that are terrible that they just go on and on in your brain. It's just so prolonged and so horrible. But and it's because of the importance it was to you, in a sense, the magnitude of it in your brain. It is believed. Now, this has been studied in relatively modest ways because it's hard to simulate your experience in a car crash, okay? So there's a little bit of speculation involved in this, but this is what people believe in general.
Yeah, it's probably not an ethical experiment to set up car crashes for people
No,
to
no,
see how they interpret time.
Near-death experiences are not a
No, I think that would be a hard
simulate.
sell for a lot of people.
You get protest, and it's hard to get a human experimentation.
Yeah, understandable.
Yeah. Right.
David and a couple of other folks had a really interesting question that I hadn't thought of before, but why does our perception of time seem to change as we get older?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. And the question is, it's really interesting. I think it's because basically it's also reflecting in the fact of our slowing. Yeah, you could say if it's related to distance, the distance is the same distance is longer. Or maybe we overcompensate for the fact that the distance seems so much longer. But anyway, it is definitely distorted when we get older. And you could say all of the processes that support it, the churning that's occurring in our brain, those predictable processes are subject to deterioration, are subject to change. They basically the chemical constituents, the time constants that govern the elemental processes in our brain that relate to the transmission of information in our brain. So, for example, one thing that happens in an old brain, especially a brain that's not well attended to, is it demyelinates. And when it demyelinates, that's not a way to say it's losing its insulation. And when it loses the insulation on the wires, the transmission in the wires slow down. And then because things are slower now and less precise moment by moment in time, that the connections between neurons change. They have to change to deal with the difference of the sloppy way information is delivered, more sloppily, less precisely moment by moment in time. So the chemistry actually changes. A whole series of things occur that change the way that the timing of the elemental events that we use to gauge time. So I think that's the primary reason that our perception of time is changing. That we're basically changing this fundamental way the brain is churning across time, especially in the areas of the brain that deal with more complex operations. So when we think about those more complex aspects of our life, things change in the time frame in which we perceive them.
It's so interesting because, I think back to when I was a child and the amount of time that I have lived was such a short time, everything felt so significant. But now that I am older, you sort of your brain picks and chooses things that you remember and the things that you emphasize.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So I think, go ahead, Mike.
No, just say we're good at skimming, we're good at skim across our lives. And we come to a good thing and we go, we have a little time moment,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we also do that when we think forward. You get to something that when the forward that we dwell on, that we hang on, that we're really interested in, and we do that. I get caught up in that all of the time when I think about where I'm going as in science or in life.
Going back to the describing lengths of time, I know we had asked people to write into the chat, how far is it to the grocery store? almost everybody did not put distance. They put time. It takes me 5 minutes to get to the grocery store. It takes me 10 minutes to get to the grocery store. We had one person answer in kilometers, and that was it. So to that person who answered in kilometers, thank you.
Well, of course, if you ask them to translate that into distance, they'd be equally good at. They could translate time to distance pretty accurately, because we have calibrated our world in 2 dimensions, and we think about almost everything in these physical, and it's in part, it's because it's what's in front of us. You know, it is what we can put our hands on or measure with our ruler, and it's difficult in time itself, as the ethereal thing that it is, to deal with it in any other way. We need to calibrate ourselves by the physical world that we operate in some way.
Yeah.
And, you know, isn't it interesting that something so fundamental, so elemental to us, such a basic part of us, is such a mystery? To my mind, it's sort of like consciousness itself. You know, we think about what a wonderful thing it is, our ability to operate on the fabric of time, and it's also, in a sense, frightening, because we also see our futures. But it's still a miracle, like our consciousness is a miracle, like the self-genesis of our powers and our understanding of the strange world we live in and that we created in our brains is a miracle. It's a tremendous gift. It's a tremendous gift.
Absolutely. All right, I've got one final question, because I see a lot of concerned participants in the Q&A section who are wondering, if you started losing your sense of time, can this be reversed? Are there specific exercises in BrainHQ that might help with this? What are sort of your recommendations for that?
Well, I think that's a thing that you can do. And you can also do other everyday activities in which you're going to sharpen your operations in time, and you can speed up a little, and speed up in your fast decision making. I mean, I hate to use words like pickleball or anything you do in life that basically requires that you translate what you see or feel or hear into action in time, you know, is good. And BrainHQ is very good at it, because it's very efficient, and the time spent on it, even though it sometimes seems like a lot of time, maybe, but the time spent on it is highly useful to your brain. So I don't know of anything that's sort of more practically useful, you know, than going to the brain gym and basically exercising yourself. But there's all kinds of things you can do in life that are sort of time sensitive. And you can just think about engaging your brain in ways that are time sensitive. It's crucial that you keep that frontal part of your brain connected. Losing your sense of time requires that you keep that frontal part of your brain connected. And in order to do that, you need to be always delivering high quality, highly salient information to it. And that means that it's not like people intuitively think. They think that if they work at problem solving or puzzle completing or things like that, that will do it. That's not enough. You have to actually continuously refine the way your brain is processing information that's being delivered to these higher levels. You have to work at refining your vision in accuracy and speed, refining your listening in accuracy and speed. And if you do that, you have a wonderful thing that it generalizes to refining your operations in speed everywhere across the brain. So that's just about the best thing you can do. And I hate to sound like a salesman, but that's why we created this. I mean, that's why built this. It's based on this.
That was the whole pitch, was, hey, we've tested this on monkeys and it shows really promising results. Let's get it into the hands of humans and start helping people worldwide.
Most of the experiments were done in rats, but
rats, yes.
But humans are, you know, rat-like in a lot of ways. So, you know. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up for the webinar today. But Mike, did you have any final words of wisdom that you'd like to impart upon our audience?
First of all, I wish I could see the audience and meet some of you more in person. I know I'd enjoy that. And just you know, do what you can to continue to refine and take care of your sense of time. And you know, you don't want to lose your abilities to operate in the domain of mental time travel. And because it's one of the more wonderful things that we do. Oh, I want to say just another thing. There's another way to help sustain your operations in time. It's called music. Music is related to dance. Wow, those are kind of fun. So there are ways, there are natural activities, I should have mentioned those, that are also time-rich activities. And not just listening, but I mean, performance is also wonderful, you know. Keeping track of time in anything you do in ways in which you're continually improving the precision of it, you know, the gauging of it, the weighing of it, the measuring of it, it's good. So basically pay attention to your brain on time and keep your brain on time. That's my advice.
Ah, so good. All right. Well, thank you again so much, Mike, for running that presentation today. It's always a joy having you on these webinars. For everyone else in the audience who stuck around, I know we ran a little long. Thank you for your patience. And thank you so much for tuning into the webinar today and asking all of those wonderful questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get an opportunity to answer them all. If you are interested in our next webinar, we have a webinar taking place on September 13th, and it's going to be called Challenge On, Tackling the Most Difficult BrainHQ Exercises. So that's going to be one that me and our CEO, Henry, are going to be running together. We did a similar one last year. It was a lot of fun. We went over exercises like True North, and auditory ACE and card shark, very tricky exercises that people have questions about. So if you want to ask questions and get live demos of those tricky exercises or those exercises that you struggle with, look out for an invitation, an email invitation to that webinar a week beforehand. All right. Other than that, I think we are all good to go here. Thank you again, Mike, so much for your time. Thank you again, audience, and happy brain training. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye.